There is the one still that's in OC that was right by my old house, so I got to go back there now that it's there. But I did go get in and out within the first, I think it was 3 days that I was back because
What was the what was the first like California thing you got when you got back?
Mexican place called Jalapenos. It's in Santa Ana, I guess.
Okay.
But yeah, it's like pretty good, pretty good. I wouldn't say it's like you got to go try it, but it's just like I've always eaten that growing up, so I had to go get it.
Valid, valid. I mean, we're in SoCal. I'm assuming there's no good Mexican food in Nashville.
There was some good burrito tacos relativistically, I guess.
So, so the
It
answer to the
was
question was no. Compared to LA,
compared to
absolutely not.
I was gonna say compared to the taco truck line streets of LA, I'm not sure anywhere would compare. But Nashville, for what it was worth, like for being more than halfway across the country and being a southern state, it had decent Mexican food. It was all right.
Valid. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome into another episode of Late Night Bitcoin with me, Q, your host, and I'm joined by none other than my good friend from Bitcoin Magazine, BTCCasey. Casey, welcome to the show, my friend.
Q, thanks for having me on. I'm super excited to be here. There's just so little to talk about these days. It'll be hard to come up with something, but hopefully we'll hit on some interesting things.
Yeah, we will be diving into all things, SVB, bailouts, Bitcoin pumping in price, all of that stuff. But after I ask the all important question that we always start this show with, which is, how did you first hear about Bitcoin and what was your initial reaction?
So I could start a couple ways. I think I'll start with the way that I actually learned about Bitcoin, like in depth, which was through my friend Jack. And Jack would talk to me about Bitcoin before I really understood that it was not just a inner centralized sort of exchange thing. I thought it was just like you had to go on a website or something like that. He explained to me that it was more like a protocol, as I know it now, or a program that you would run on a computer that communicated to all the other computers running the Bitcoin program. And so once I started to learn more about the fundamentals of how this technology actually worked, I got interested enough to invest in it. It was just before the COVID-19 pandemic at the time when I really started to learn about it from him. And I think things just lined up perfectly at that time with the sudden change in the world around me, and being able to take a step back and look at what was going on with all the money printing and the economic changes that were occurring around us at the time. And that's when I sort of got into it. Yeah. But he told me first about it mostly through mining because he was doing his own home mining project. And that wowed me that you could just sort of plug into the electric grid and produce these coins that had value and then instantly, transfer them away to an exchange or whatever. That whole system interested me. But yeah, that's mostly how I learned through it. I learned about it way back in 2015 when I was way younger, but I didn't even, take a big gander at it until later on.
So we're gonna get into it all, but I want to remind everyone in the audience watching both live and later to please make sure you smash the subscribe button down below, as well as smash the like button so more people can join us. And if you have any question, please feel free to throw it in the chat box and we will address. But Casey, why don't you, being Bitcoin Magazine's news reporter, do you mind walking us through just sort of in quasi, I'm not going to be strict about a chronological order of what happened between Silvergate and then Silicon Valley Bank, which then led to videos of bank runs that we saw on Saturday here in our state of California?
Yeah, so starting off with Silvergate, I think that was 5 days ago now, which seems a long time ago, actually, given all the news that's happened in between then and now. Silvergate was probably, I would consider it the most connected into the crypto world, right? Like it had its hands really deep here, in that it was the main bank for exchanges like Kraken, I think Coinbase. It had a little network, there's that graphic that goes around where it's like little tendrils going between basically the largest United States exchanges. And it served as their banking partner. And I actually wrote a story about that in which I linked to Dylan LeClaire's coverage of it. And he essentially described at its most basic level that they got in over their heads with the fractional reserve system. And now with the recent rate hikes and then some other economic and financial decisions they made, a small, relativistically small bank run caused a complete collapse of that bank. Now, today we've got all these other things going on, but the progenitor of the larger news is the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. Now that was a true old-fashioned bank run, and we really witnessed the power of social media in today's age to facilitate not only the spread of information, but then action based upon that information, right? And so it's sort of a novel experience, I think, in terms of the power of social media in that regard. But anyways, Silicon Valley Bank was a $200+ billion bank based out of California that was the main banking partner for many tech startups, even some crypto related startups, all sorts of companies. And I mean, its tendrils reach far. To, for example, my father, I asked him, he's retired now, but he used to work for a California tech company. And I asked him, hey, do you know about Silicon Valley Bank? He goes, oh, yeah, that used to be our main banking partner. So, yeah, so it
So
just goes to show.
if your dad was not retired, he would not be getting paid this week, potentially.
That's literally what I thought. I was like, wow, it's a wild to think that it would have gone so deep as to like my own father maybe would have been affected had he not been retired. Um, so it's a very prominent bank to say the least. It's far-reaching impacts. So that was a bank run, and they had, according to Dylan LeClaire, I listened to his Citadel Dispatch with Matt Odell, and it was pretty good. He described how basically they were super long, or they bet hard at least on these treasury bills that at low interest rates were a really cool idea, because basically their banking system allowed them to provide no kickback to the people banking with them, and they just collect the 1% on these treasuries, and that was their whole sort of cash cow. In comes this massive spike in interest rates over the last few months, as we've seen, and now their whole sort of charade comes to an end. And all it took was another bank run to the likes of Silvergate to basically collapse the entire system. And as a result, Signature Bank was sort of a contagion bank run, as far as I can see it. Now, there was interesting to note one of the board members of Signature Bank saying that it almost felt like the feds were out to end crypto-related banking services. We can get further into that, but to say the least, Signature Bank seemed to be more of a contagion problem related to SVB. Obviously, they were sort of doing the same financial plays, but I don't think Signature Bank would have gone down if SVB hadn't. But it's all semi-related. It goes back to the interest rates just hiking up, and you can no longer facilitate certain financial setups, and these banks are really showing that.
There's also one more thing I kind of want to touch on before we start getting into, what else has happened as a result, and then sort of the effects of all these decisions. But when you bring up, for example, the power of social media that led to these bank runs, I think there's also another thing which is worth highlighting or pointing out. In addition to social media, it's just the fact that, I can access the bank accounts that I have on my cell phone right now. I can access them on my laptop right now. And the truth is, in 2008, it wasn't that easy. Bank of America didn't have an app on their cell phone. Chase didn't have an app on their cell phone. Like Wells Fargo, there's no app on your cell phone. And so I think a combination of those two things, because then you don't physically have to go to the bank, which also then made me laugh so hard. And like, if you look closely at the picture that Lawrence Lepard, and I say this with the utmost respect, like, the boomers of Bitcoin are posting, like the people lining up the bank are also really old. It's like, guys, you could do this from home. You know that, right?
I was literally about to say, I found it really funny when I saw those pictures of the bank runs because I was like, man, you could just call the support line, wait in line on your phone. But I get it. I mean, if you've got millions in the bank, you want to go speak to a real person. I did see the comments that was like, there's young people walking by as these old people are lined up, and it's actually a really interesting juxtaposition to consider. But yeah, it's interesting, especially these bank runs are happening like in California, as you said. It's just in some of the most wealthy areas of this state, and happening to tech companies, which have really buoyed not really only the state, but just the nation in general. These tech companies have contributed massively to the GDP and growth and futurism essentially of the country. And so now we're seeing what happens when these entities live in a high interest rate environment, and it's a lot of them, don't exist.
There's also another thing that in a few things that I want to point to before, again, we get into sort of what else has happened. Um, this is something that I learned today. Did you know that Silicon Valley Bank in the last 8 months of 2022, literally up until January, did not have someone in the risk chair? They didn't have anyone running risk at Silicon Valley Bank, but they did manage to hire someone for diversity inclusion.
Yeah, I saw we tweeted about it on Bitcoin Magazine. If you saw that tweet, and I mean, is diversity important? Yeah, but there has to be a certain prioritization of protecting your customers' money, and the fact that they didn't have any sort of chief risk manager, or obviously it looks like they really weren't paying attention to risk at all, at least not in adverse environments. And so when you have situations like this, you can't help but think about these different avenues that the bank was going. You saw that, I don't know if you saw, but they were spending millions on these advertisements that were sort of just like, we're a cool bank. Like it was almost like a show about them. And so when you see all these
Red
interesting
flags.
expenditures, yeah, it's like, what were you doing and what were you thinking? And you had $200 billion worth of plus of customer funds and untold economic generation, economic value generation at your custody, and you really squandered it on stupid crap. So it's pretty crazy.
Well, another thing that they managed to squander it on is their execs. Not only did their CEO sell like $3.6 million of stock like a week ago, they also got their bonuses and walked away with their bonuses, which I'm sure will end up they'll be forced to return them. But like truly remarkable the galls on these people. Um, and then there's like, with that said, in my opinion, all of the blame, or at least like 99% of it, I put on just the execs at Silicon Valley Bank. They didn't handle their business the right way. They didn't calculate risk. Like, okay, you didn't think that the rate hikes were going to happen this quickly. Well, it wasn't like it was all done in one rate hike. There were consecutive rate hikes, and you just repeatedly did not hedge against your position. So that, I think, again, just it it just reads to me like people were asleep at the wheel. Um, and then there's that 1% that I'm gonna point the finger at someone that people are just gonna be like, Q, like, he's just he hates Trump, so whatever. But Donald fucking Trump, and I'll explain why. In 2018, Donald Trump made changes to the Dodd-Frank Act that essentially prior to these changes, it required banks with $50 billion of assets or more to have to comply to the Fed stress test, and amongst other just sort of stricter regulations to make sure, they were liquid, they didn't have certain issues and weren't going to be faced with the potential bank run, i.e. like they didn't want to repeat Washington Mutual. 2018, Trump changes this to, instead of a $50 billion cap, it's $250 billion now. And Silicon Valley Bank, in addition, spent money on lobbyists for the last 4 years to lobby and make sure that it stayed at this level and they maintained their balance at this 200, $210 billion range to avoid that threshold of extra scrutiny. And to Boomer, to your point, like SVB is not a small bank. Like this was based on total amount of deposits, the number 17 largest bank before its collapse. Like this was a significant bank. Um, I want to get into now, unless there's anything else, Casey, you want to add or you wanted to comment on like before.
No, I mean, I would say I would agree with you and say it's also, you know, I would say I'm mostly leaning on the side that it's the executive's fault, but I would say we are, living in that sort of proto-capitalist world where um, if you have the money to burn on lobbying and to get the political sway you need, you can reduce the amount of checks on your business practices. And in a system that's heavily skewed with the fiat system, with fiat money, the financial sides of things can get way over risked when you start pushing a lot of deregulation. But that's not to say I'm pro regulation. It's just this is what we get sometimes when we have when we go that route, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, they lobby. It even puts, I think, the onus on them a little bit more because they went out of their way to spend the money to lobby instead of spending the money to just get someone to run risk, like calculate risk for you, so you don't run into this issue. Um, so I want to now discuss sort of the response first, and then sort of what we have seen since the announcement of the response. And you know, in the vein of, it was really interesting to see the power of social media that triggered the bank runs. You also saw that on social media during this collapse, pretty much Friday up until Sunday, excuse me, where, I'll name names. People like Jason Calacanis are just all caps calling for a bailout, calling for the government to step in, backstop these things. And there were a lot of different rumors swirling around. Some of the rumors that I saw were that apparently Goldman Sachs at one point made an offer to acquire Silicon Valley Bank, but it was actually blocked because the government said that that was too much concentration into one bank. They didn't want to do that. And then lo and behold, JP Morgan is announcing like we opened like thousands of new business accounts as a result of this because people were moving their business out of Silicon Valley Bank and over to us. Like the effect that the government wanted to avoid, it has already happened. And then you started to see this rumor that when I saw it for the first time, I was like, no fucking way. But the idea that the Fed was going to come out and essentially say, hey, we'll backstop the bank's losses to make everyone whole. It was a fucking rumor on Saturday that then came true on Sunday. And just to put the cherry on top, literally from the second this announcement was made by the Fed, Bitcoin has just straight gone up and to the right. Like it is just pumped, acquiring that liquidity. But let's walk through the weekend a little bit. I want to hear from you first, ignoring what the decision was. On the spectrum of options, put yourself in Powell and Yellen's shoes. You somehow are now both Fed chair and the head of the Treasury. What is your, Casey's, response to this?
Probably the same. I mean, I really don't.
Socialist.
I mean, we live in the system, right? We live in the system, and then also like we would have had a lot of troubles, I think, on Monday morning, this morning, if they hadn't taken this step. I think there would have been some incredible pain to be had in the tech sector and people not getting paid. And I mean, I don't even know right now if people are able to get their money out, if it's that easy or what. I'm sure it's a terrible time trying to contact the whatever the governments have set up in regards to facilitating that. So yeah, I probably would have chosen the same thing. I mean, walking through the weekend, I'll say first, I thought it was hilarious because I saw Jason was like in a comment saying the VCs who, called fire when the building's on fire should be called heroes. I just thought that was funny. I don't know. It was a funny comment.
You
But
mean he wanted to call himself a hero? After wait, pause. It was Peter Thiel who said it first, and then David Sachs took what Peter Thiel was saying and applied it to himself and his businesses. And then Jason took what David Sachs was applying from Peter Thiel. So Jason Calacanis is respect him, but sometimes, bro, just like you're such an attention whore.
it's the besties. He's a bestie with.
I love the besties. Like I listen to their takes. I made a point to listen to their pod for this week, and like usually I delay. I wait like a half a week until I find like no, I waited until it came out and dropped, and to the point of what you're saying, like I can understand why these depositors didn't like. This was gonna have a ripple effect that was very damaging, absolutely. But where it kind of sits wrong with me to a degree is like FDIC insurance has been a thing since 1933. The limits were raised after the 2008 financial crisis, and in like I'll quote Jason Calacanis himself, like in this most recent episode of the All In podcast, they talked about how like in his first fund, the exec that he had partnered with essentially every Friday was rebalancing the bank accounts to make sure that they were all insured by FDIC. And the fund had multiple accounts. And so there's a degree in which I hear that story from Jason, and then I sit there and I'm like, are you telling me you were taught that lesson and you just opted to not apply it, not teach it, not pay it forward? And you just left a lot of your businesses and the founders you work with that's such a valuable lesson in my opinion. And I'm frankly in the camp of like, I get why the government bailed them out. I do. And there's a degree where you could argue and say like it's not, it's like a Budweiser is a bailout, and this is like a Bud Light, or honestly even it's just a Natty Light bailout. Like it's still beer, it'll still get you drunk. It's gonna take you a lot more to get you drunk than just like a shot or whatever. But like they're not printing money today, but they will print money if and when it's required. And they didn't close the loop. It's not like it's just in this instance. It's, well, you're gonna like no matter what, your bank is fine. Your bank is fine. Your bank gets a bailout. You're like, it's like the Fed played Oprah here. Like what is the incentive for these bankers? Now you have a new hat you got to put on, Casey. I want you to be just like an investment banker at just any bank. Let's start with a big bank. What is your incentive now using customer funds for, the way banks do business, which I'm starting to feel like, am I talking about FTX for a second, or am I just talking about our banking system right now?
Right. Yeah.
Like, actually, anyways, I smoked weed, so that's why my head is going, we got to focus cue. Okay. So you're working at a big bank. Like, what incentive do you have to not take like a bigger risk now? Because the Fed is going to backstop it and like your customers are fine. Like, what is your incentive to not take that bigger risk?
Well, there is none. And I think that's why Jason was so, maybe he didn't learn that lesson from his experience, was that realistically, the VCs knew that this was a sort of parade kept on by the music of cheap money. And inevitably things were going to come to an end when they've just been doling out, checks left and right for these startups that some of them were, most of them were not profitable. So you have a system that's unsustainable, and these VCs are smart enough to figure out that most of it's backed by money that doesn't really exist, or at least was being created out of thin air at the time. And I think they realized that this sort of, the tight system we've been under has only been for like 6 months or 8 months. Like it's not, we haven't really felt the belt tighten a lot until very recently. And so I think they knew that was such a short-lived thing, because what if SVB went down? They knew that this was not going to end with all the depositors losing their money whether it was SVB or a whole different, status in terms of something failing. I think they knew that this was going to be backed up by the Fed. And so as an investment banker, as anyone who really has a large amount of capital under their control right now, who doesn't have a huge incentive in regards to it being their own or something like that, you kind of can now operate under the assumption that whatever, financial risk you take as in regards to storing your money can be backed up by the Federal Reserve. And I that was what was stunning to me when you were talking about we saw on Saturday predictions of, maybe there's a step in here, and then Sunday it just boom, here it is. That was what was interesting to me is what you mentioned about it not really having a closed loop. What they were really guaranteeing is that no matter who it is, they will come in and step in. And they were saying, like, this is to restore the confidence in the US banking system. Well, what's that backed by? It's the Federal Reserve. And the thing that makes all the money in the world and the whole thing, the whole system is backing these banks, that it really makes you wonder, like, what's to stop people who bank from outside of the US, they're banking with the US, right? Say you're another sovereign country. Are you looking at the US banking system right now the same way you were just a couple of weeks ago? I don't think you would, personally. At least I'm not. And so, some of these, I don't think, we've hit a point where the sales are going to totally drop or whatever, and we're just going to sit dead in the water. But I think there's been holes poked, per se. And all of a sudden, I'm sure the smarter adversaries, financial adversaries or whatever, what have you, economic and nation state adversaries, I'm sure they're looking at this situation as a massive, massive opportunity to convince others, hey, look, this whole United States banking system is really just a giant pin on the Federal Reserve. And if you want to pull it all out, it's not that hard.
You bring up such an excellent point as far as, being a sovereign nation, and, if you have money tied up, or even just, a high net worth individual who's not from America, who, has accounts here, like, how can you genuinely watch this transpire and think to yourself, like, better there than in my country, or better there than in gold or in Bitcoin, or just it, or like, I hate saying it, or even real estate. Like, it starts to beg the question of, if I don't need liquid assets, maybe it's best to put and park money outside of the US for at least some time. And by some time, I genuinely mean, like, until the US enters a Bitcoin standard, or at least a sound money standard. And I'll say sound money because I don't expect us to go to a Bitcoin standard next, to be quite frank. The question now has populated in my head, and I'm going to ask this now, but, obviously FTX, if you've been living under a rock, Sam Bankman-Fried, your nerdy hero, was stealing money from clients apparently, and using that for Alameda to trade with. And I understand, like, that's an investment, or FTX was an exchange, and Alameda was not necessarily a banking entity. It was an investment sort of VC or whatever it technically was, as far as, like, a legal entity is concerned. But are you telling me that if all SBF had to do was get a banking charter to put everything under, then he was fine? Because that, like, to me, it just sounds like that's essentially what the banking system does. They take client funds and they go and they invest and they trade what they think is risk-free, which we'll get into that side of it. But they're going and trading, they're going and investing, making investment decisions off of client funds. And now the federal government is saying, well, if you're a chartered bank, we'll cover you. But if you're not a bank, like, if you, Casey, lose money investing, unless you're a bank, like, you're screwed. Did SBF fuck up by not getting a banking charter to put everything under? And I'm not trying to be an SBF apologist here. Like, you should rot in jail. But
hindsight is 2020. But I think you're pointing out something that's true and correct now, but I also think we're looking at a changing game here, right? Where banks are consolidating. I really truly believe that what we're witnessing the starts of here is a consolidation into major banks alone, and everyone will have these bank accounts that are only, even if there's front ends that put a paint on it, like SoFi basically being a paint on SVB or not SVB, their primary banking partner. I forget the name of it right now, but there's various, financial apps I think is what the term they use, that are basically paints on banking backends right now. I think we're going to see that for major banks essentially, and so I think theoretically, would it now be sort of understood that chartered banks are covered, and so everyone should try and become a chartered bank? Yeah, but I also think that becoming a bank is going to become harder because they want to see consolidation into these singular banks, and they were sending out, according to a tweet I saw from I think Warren at Blockstream. He talked about how his friend in banking was getting notices from everyone that the federal government has been basically reaching out to them saying, are you connected to crypto? If you're not, you're good to go. And they didn't, obviously explain further than that. But I think there's a crackdown going on right now as far as crypto related banking. And I think there's a consolidation in wider banking practices in which, it's not going to be overnight. I don't think everyone's going to have a JP Morgan account, next week. But I could certainly see over the next 5 years the consolidation coming, smaller banks being either not able to exist in this adversarial environment with high interest rates and such, or just I think regulation will probably play an important role going forward. Over the next couple of years, we're going to see a reaction, quote unquote, to this event or these events, and that is going to have a major impact on these smaller banks.
I want to talk the consolidation because you bring up an excellent point, and it's a very dangerous precedent, unfortunately, that we're going to see set. And it just goes back to the notion that all markets are moved more by human emotions and psychology than they are by anything else. And that is what makes every market imperfect. I want to make sure I clarify and say that is what I'm trying to say. Because of that human element that is involved, and you see it transpire right here. And Casey, to your point, like I'm curious what you think the short term and then potentially the long term effect of only having, let's just say it gets to a point in the future where there are only 5 major banks that you have the option of banking with. Like, what does that inevitably lead to? Does that lead to like just a nationalization of the banking system? Does that lead to like digital US digital currencies or like Fed coin or something like that? Like, what are short-term, long-term consequences that you see coming from a system like that?
Well, I've seen people calling it nationalization of banking already, or socialization of banking. I've seen on Twitter already people calling this whole process. I think, if on the long term it turns out to be that, then maybe, yeah, in hindsight, yeah, this is the start of that. I wouldn't be so quick to call it that yet. But if we did see, say, 5 major banks develop and everyone is connected to those only, the implications are very similar in my mind to what we would see if we did see like a CBDC come out, or something in similar nature. I covered a couple, I think it was a couple weeks ago, or maybe even just a week ago. Time flies in Bitcoin, but I covered something recently that was comments on the Treasury's basically probe into the creation of a CBDC. And they were discussing some very interesting things related to what Mark Goodwin has basically been predicting this whole time. Mark Goodwin being the editor of the print magazine at Bitcoin Magazine. And he had written pieces, I think when he was still just a contributor, not even the editor, so like almost a year and a half plus ago, about a CBDC not necessarily taking the form of a nationalized central bank literal issued currency, but rather it could ride on the backs of a stable coin that gets co-opted essentially. It could be a private issued currency through which we see many third parties involved, which is sort of what I'm sort of leaning to. Uh, but basically, the way I see it is, if this banking crisis is quote unquote taken advantage of in the way that we think it might be with regulation and the consolidation of banking, the results are very similar to that sort of outcome uh, of a CBDC or similar privately issued, but essentially, centrally controlled currency. And I think we're headed down that path no matter what. It's just whether or not this sort of banking system, as we know it, ends up sort of, persisting into the future. And if that's the case, I could see it definitely just being this consolidation of four major, banks that everyone uses.
On the topic of stablecoins as well, because we haven't really dived into this side of the Silicon Valley contagion, but we talked a little bit about just the extensive, like, we didn't even actually talk about names, but just the fact that there are so many tech companies that had accounts with Silicon Valley Bank that were going to be impacted by this, from small startups to behemoths of companies like Roku and even Uber. I mean, there were some that I saw somewhere circulating a list where, like, one company, I think it was like Lemonade, like the big uh, IPO from 2021 Lemonade. Uh, they had like an account with like $7,000. So there were some of these companies' names that you will see circulating online that had very insignificant sums that were fully FDIC insured, but then you have a company like Roku with hundreds of millions of dollars, and you're just like, guys, like, what is going on here? How is no one calculating risk like this? Or how is anyone calculating risk and allowing these decisions to get made? But another entity that got caught up in all this frenzy is Circle, USDC. And, they depegged for a while, and it was up until the Fed made this decision that it looked like it was going to lose the peg, and then it quickly reverted back. And now you have Udi taking a victory lap saying, like, I told you so. And you're, in the back of my head, I'm going, right. And a broken clock is right twice a day, my guy. Like, what about all the other calls you made that were wrong? Like, um, talk to me a little bit about the impact of USDC, and just, again, going through human psychology a little bit. Like, is the confidence of A, USDC, or B, just stable coins in general, potentially now being called into question, because you have to understand, like, where are they banking with now all of a sudden?
Yeah, I mean, USDC being a major stablecoin is, any depegging, let alone the quite drastic depegging. I saw a pretty major wick. I don't know if it was similar, the exact same on all exchanges and all platforms, but it was a very significant wick down for such a major stablecoin. And so, um, for people who a lot of people utilize stablecoins in third world developing countries, I think is the term now, developing countries, as their primary store of value. And so to see that, it was actually a little disheartening personally. I mean, I don't care, regardless of the feelings about the practices of the people who are in charge of these protocols or the stablecoins themselves or what have you, people get significantly impacted by that. But yeah, I mean, I think it it's really interesting for me because, as far as I'd heard, an environment like this theoretically should be pretty productive for stablecoins, if you are fundamentally sound and you have the proper reserves. Um, you know, you go back to what you were saying about human emotion. Uh, the slightest fear around a stablecoin, I feel like, can be amplified because it is like uh, pegged to the dollar. So one, there's a fundamental like function that keeps this thing stable, and it can be impacted very quickly by changes in people's balances or major withdrawals, huge depositor runs, etc. But also, I just think when you have a trusted form, it's almost like T-bills, right? And when there's a major run on something that's so trusted, obviously the effects are going to be pretty drastic. So theoretically, do I believe that everyone will eventually learn that Bitcoin is the only true stable coin and, USDC is a shitcoin, right? Yes, but do I want to see such a quick depegging that might lead to, some really major turmoil for people who trusted such a protocol? No. So I was glad to see that the step in, had the intended effect, at least as far as USDC was concerned, and rectified that depegging. But really difficult to not kind of eventually want to see some sort of like, if they're taking such financial risk and they're supposedly a stable coin, et cetera, then, the reckoning will happen regardless of whether we like it or not. So,
I mean, and I'm just simply strong manning or at least playing the other side of this. But to me, quite frankly, the risk that Circle took was just banking with SVB. Like they weren't the ones sort of taking their funds and aping into like an NFT or something absurd. Like no, they just banked with the wrong people. Which like
yeah, their
again,
risk department should theoretically like be able to,
diversify.
yeah. I mean, if you're supposed to be a worldwide level, protocol for the US dollar, and then, you're exposed significantly to the American system, and then a single American bank essentially going down will take you out. That's trouble for everyone else who's using yours, who's not an American. I mean, what are they supposed to do, So I do think there's reason to uh, blame both, right? Like SVB, this is just another thing to point at and say, like, look at how much trust was basically in your institution, and now you took so many risks, and something like USDC is just totally thrown off. But
So as I mentioned, the Fed makes this announcement where they're going to backstop all of the losses. USTC repegs, and you also have Bitcoin pump. We're going to get into that in a second, but I again just want to remind everyone in the audience to please make sure you press the like button down there. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, please do so. If you're listening on the podcast later, please leave us a review so that more people can discover and join these conversations. Casey, I want to get your sort of feeling, like what was going through your head on the Fed announcement. Did you immediately go and just ape into Bitcoin and just like dump more money, take out a loan and just dump it into Bitcoin at that moment? Because I did.
I'll be honest. I'll be very transparent here. I was worried at first about all the transpirings and, short term, at least, what it could mean for Bitcoin, because generally, my thoughts have been that when people don't have money, Bitcoin doesn't have money, as in people don't buy Bitcoin, and because Bitcoin's usually been a bit of a excess money sort of expenditure, at least as far as we've seen. When markets do well, Bitcoin does well. Now, I found it incredibly compelling, though, that Bitcoin performed well in this environment, because not only did we see the Fed announcement and the bank failures, but those banks were heavily connected to the cryptocurrency industry. So you would think, like, if you had, gone back 2 months ago and said, let's remove Silvergate, Signature, and SVB, and let's do it, over essentially a week period between Silvergate and Signature, and no, there's going to be no impact, not even just no impact on Bitcoin, but Bitcoin will pump. I don't think I would have agreed. I would have been like, no, there's got to be some sort of rails that got thrown off here, or there's got to be some form of like fuckery that essentially, is impinging the advance in the Bitcoin price. And yet we still see it surge up, and in the most proper situation for it to do so. So I really think that was heartening as a Bitcoiner who has been really waiting, not waiting. Obviously, I don't anticipate bank runs, but as someone who has been very interested in seeing how Bitcoin performs in a direct environment like 2008 per se. I don't think we've reached the extent of 2008, but I do think this is like a little teaspoon taste of what 2008 is representative of, and it performed quite how you would expect it to if you were really bullish on Bitcoin. So I thought it was really interesting. I was, when I saw the Fed thing, like I said, I was a little afraid that, we were in trouble, but it ended up being good for Bitcoin. So
So we talked a little bit about the besties and this conversation or this part of the conversation while you were talking also triggered this thought, but you haven't listened to the latest episode, have you?
No, no. I usually once a month I'll listen to them every once in a while.
So the besties actually dunked on Bitcoin for like a second. If you weren't paying attention, you missed it.
Hmm.
Um, but they actually like they brought up something where to your point, I was like, actually, Bitcoin has thus far performed exactly how you would expect in a moment of crisis like this, where you know people panic, and when people panic, they sell because they think they need cash. They need to feel and see the cash in their hands to feel safe and secure. So watching
Hmm.
Bitcoin sell off, watching the whole stock market sell off, but that none of that was surprising. And Chamath made a comment saying like Bitcoin is now officially failed. Like all those Bitcoin bros who are like, oh, Bitcoin is meant for like moments like this, like it failed. It was crashing in price in that moment. And I was like, no, that's short sighted. And to your point, like we don't have a full blown bailout. Like I've said before, like this is bailout light. This is
Mm.
the natty light of bailouts, with the
Yeah.
exception that it's literally like you've got a closet full of them because you don't know how many you're gonna fucking drink because you don't know how many banks are in this situation, and so it it starts to I think raise a lot of concerns. And again, like my dad called me this morning and he was like, "Holy shit, what's going on with Bitcoin?" I told him what happened. And I was like, they bailed out the depositors, and as a result, once they announced that, Bitcoin has just gone up ever since. And if the stock market was open 24/7 like Bitcoin is, I'd I'm a gambler. I have a gambling problem, and I would bet a lot of money. I would even put Bitcoin on the line to say if the stock market was open 24/7, the stock market would have pumped at the exact moment the Bitcoin did off of the Fed's news, and that's why we saw the markets pump today. Like it
Yeah.
wasn't like the whole market read it like a bailout or reading it like a bailout. They're just posturing and trying to avoid that word, but at its core, that's all this is.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing the preliminary announcements of the March 2020 pumping of our bags essentially. And so the, recent weeks, lower down to 19-20K could be interpreted as that jump down to 3K and then boom. Realistically, anyone who's looking at what the Fed announced realizes that they will print money in order to pin the system up. And they'll do that on the most fundamental levels, which is to make sure the banks don't fail. And so I think, yeah, the market was responding to the signs that the Fed presented, whether or not it, directly alluded to them or not. The market understood, hey, we're not at risk here of total collapse, at least not without a massive printing of US dollars to at least try and stifle that or stop that.
So I want to talk on the other side of this now because, like, I get it. You're sick of hearing about Silicon Valley Bank. I get it. You're sick of the talking heads, but I promise you, like, this is unfortunately we're so far from done on this. We only have a little bit more than 10 minutes though with you, Casey. So it is late night TV, guys. I got a bedtime. Casey's got a bedtime. So I want to talk though because tomorrow CPI numbers come out, and next week there's an FOMC meeting.
Mhm.
Now, in the midst of this bank run on Saturday, at least, the odds for an FOMC rate hike, I actually, truthfully, I didn't look at them today, but last week, it wasn't because of the bank run. I'm now remembering. It was because of Powell's hearing in front of Congress. The odds for the rate hike shot up. So it was originally an expectation for a 25 basis point rate hike. But after Powell's speech, it was the most likely rate hike number was a 50 basis point rate hike. Now, whether or not that comes to fruition is irrelevant. The market's expectation was set at that based on Powell's posturing. But all of this was before these bank collapses, before you essentially had an injection of liquidity into the markets. Whether and how much they have injected we actually don't know. And that's another thing that I'm starting to realize. Like they're not going to come out and formally tell us. Like if Wells Fargo's like, hey, we're a little short on cash. You know that thing you did for Silicon Valley, you need to do it for us. Like you genuinely think they're going to turn around and announce that publicly? Like no, they're just going to do it under the table. At which point it's like they're just going to be printing money under the table. So if that is happening, my question is, do you expect, regardless of CPI, which comes out tomorrow, which will start to gauge, I think, people's and the market's decision and expectations, like, do you expect a rate hike next week off of the heels of this bailout light?
Next week is a long time.
This is
Compared to
true.
compared to last week, we're very, in a very different situation. But I do think they might try and keep a small rate hike, like a 25, like originally planned, only because to not do so would be such a white flag, right? Like they would be so laying down the sword and just being like, we're gonna print, like it would be so obvious. I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but it would just be a very like big um, receding into the background as far as making decisions, and really it would be the market making decisions at that point. So, and they can't let that happen, right? They have to maintain like we've got this 2% edict. We're gonna not make inflation out of control. They're still trying to get inflation under control theoretically. So so I think if you look at posturing wise, I would think that they would do a small rate hike. I don't think they'll do the 50 basis points like that the market was anticipating, or at least I don't anticipate. But to not do so, even to halt, I feel like would be such a strong sign of conceding to the market and showing that, hey, look, we can't keep this up for that much or at all. So that I think is the big point, is that it's more like, even if it's just this one, they just got to get through this one. 25 basis points more, the next one they stop, and it's like, oh, they did it right. But I think they need to make it through this one in terms of like political optics and not being too dovish, really.
Absolutely valid. Um, what though could be the type of event? Because, like you said, a week is a long time. The news that we've covered has only been over the scope of 5 days. So it's not even a whole week's worth of news that we spent the time talking about here. What could happen in the next week to make the Fed have to pause?
I think it would have to be a bank failure that's larger than SVB. Signature was 110 plus billion, and then SVB is roughly 210 plus or 220 plus billion, I think it was. So big numbers, and there aren't. It was the 16th largest bank, so SVB was in the
17th, I think. So, but like a top 20 bank. So there are
yeah,
only 15, 16, like 16 or 17 at most banks with more money than Silicon Valley.
right. And theoretically, you would think that SVB had or not a very, but a more risk oriented portfolio. I mean, they were backing all these tech companies that existed during a time, almost the entire operation as we know it came to existence during a time of low interest rates. So it's not to be expected, but certainly not out of line that something like this happened, at least relative to these other banks. If they were to go down, I feel like it would just be such a sign of systemic contagion. It wouldn't be just like, oh, they couldn't pass it off any longer as they had exposure to crypto and tech. Oh, they were risky. Oh, it was bad. Like if it's another bank, if there's a third bank involved, especially if it's not like super related to tech or crypto or whatever, or any sort of startups, if it involves a big bank, it would be a big problem, because then it would just be like, it's within the system. This is a systemic risk because of the interest rate hikes, because of the way that we sold T-bills to all these banks back when it was 1% yield, and now it's 6% or something, 5% or
It's not
something.
6%. It's like
What was it, 4%?
four. I don't think there's a T bill that's more than.
She was like 4.3 this morning or something, 4.8.
Yeah, yeah. I think actually it was as high as 5, but it cratered today.
Yeah,
Like
I saw
it
that.
cratered.
Yeah.
But there's something, and I don't mean to cut you off, but we didn't get to address that. I'd like to just for the last 5 minutes. The fact that these banks were in Silicon Valley Bank in particular was invested not entirely, but a good chunk of their portfolio was tied up in these quote unquote risk-free bonds. And like you said, it's 1% yield on things like mortgage-backed securities and freaking like I guess not technically a T-bill when it's a 10-year, but like they're treasury bills. Like the, the, I'm speechless. You can never say anything is risk-free again. Can you?
No, I mean, I think it proves that at the bottom of all that is what underpins the financial system, fiat money, right? And so, really, those quote unquote riskless investments bore the risk of the entire system. And so, when we see cracks like this, what we're really seeing into is the uh, potential risk to the entire system. And I think going forward, banks will be either regulated to crap where they have to be super protecting of all these the customer deposits and such, or um, you know people have been saying, like you said, nationalization of the banks, where there's sort of a mix between the Federal Reserve and these banks, and there's just money printing going behind the doors, and we could see something like that. There are endless different situations where we could see this, but I think at the end of the day, the quote unquote riskless option is has been revealed to truly just be backed by printed money, right? So riskless now means backed by printed money, and that's the only true like perception of it. It's not about generating the yield that's actually proper to this investment, the T bills or whatever. It's not about the actual financial underpinnings of an economic system that produces enough excess wealth to pay interest on this debt. Instead, it's like, oh, look, we can make more money. You all use it, so it's going to be accepted. And so I think that's what's what's been happening here is that's been unveiled, that little difference in definition.
Casey, we're winding down on our time, and it makes me really sad because I've been enjoying this conversation. I always love talking to you about everything. But before we go, is there anything that we didn't get a chance to touch on that you'd love to just address or speak to?
I'll say on a personal level, ordinals are sick. Bitcoin and ordinals are dope.
Those are fighting words on this show, bro.
I just think they're funny. I mean, I don't, regardless of their impact on Bitcoin, technical, whatever. It's just JPEGs on Bitcoin is hilarious to consider. And I think they're also, arbitrary data on Bitcoin has not been considered in its entirety. The we're seeing, the sovereign rollup thing that we saw wasn't. I've read that it wasn't technically a full, real sovereign rollup type implementation of Bitcoin, and it's kind of BSy, but I think we haven't fully delved into what Taproot, SegWit, like the expanded SegWit data, what all that has brought to Bitcoin. So I'm mostly excited to see what that brings relative to JPEGs on Bitcoin. But I think ordinals is freaking cool. But just because it's like such a weird new thing on Bitcoin, and Bitcoin can be really boring sometimes.
I'm so mad at you right now.
I had to end with something that was like, now you don't even get to rebut me.
Like, dude, you're so annoying. Like I sat here, I rolled this joint. I want to go smoke this joint. I will just say this on the ordinal. Like, let me ask you this: did you ever buy an NFT not on Bitcoin?
No, I didn't.
So why does it why on Bitcoin? Because it's on Bitcoin?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's on Bitcoin. It's cooler. It's cooler because it's on Bitcoin. And you know what I find compelling is like,
you through this.
Well, the inscriptions are
You've now changed fungibility. You've changed
they're
fungibility forever.
If you want to, like, that's the thing, right? It's
if
perceptive.
you want to, because of you have changed fungibility. You have made certain Satoshis more valuable than others, when in fact, one Bitcoin is supposed to equal one Bitcoin, but it doesn't anymore. Because now there's
Well,
like
I would
randomly a
one
Satoshi.
Satoshi doesn't equal one Satoshi, but one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin.
Okay, fine. One Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin, but one Satoshi does not equal one Satoshi, which in my head makes one Bitcoin not equal one Bitcoin. Like you understand how.
But in practice, it does, which is what's
And
important, right?
I want to like. I don't expect Meister to be watching this, but like, I saw his tweet where he was addressing because I brought this up yesterday too on his show, and like there's a degree where I understand like, oh, like there's so many Satoshis that like it becomes irrelevant, but like it doesn't. Over time, it actually becomes very relevant if we continue to use it.
Especially if there's a lot of inscriptions on individual Satoshis. I
I,
can agree with that. I think, yeah, I think there's massive implications that we can't yet, totally understand. And we can't. The one thing I will say is I don't think we can go back on it. Like, you've got Taproot, you've got the witness data. So that's what I think Bitcoin is going to have to grapple with and come to grips with is like, well, you can't go back on it. So the implications are what they are now. And if that means I can have a funny looking frog on my profile, then cool.
yeah, I mean, I agree with you that we don't know how it could be used. I think there are some use cases that are valid that can make sense. But if I'm being very blunt, and I intend to your face, because I have the opportunity to say it to your face, like there's a huge degree of financial privilege that you get to create this inscription for the sake of having this digital frog, when in fact, we live in this country where like we don't need Bitcoin. The fact that we're in Bitcoin is a luxury. There are people who
Yeah.
are forced into Bitcoin, and quite honestly, like people in those situations in those countries, like they could use inscriptions in far more meaningful and impactful ways today, right now. But we're using it to send each other things that, quite frankly, like I get the argument that like all the things done in shitcoin land can be done on Bitcoin, but that doesn't mean they should. Like just because
Yeah.
I can do something doesn't mean I should. But I believe in free markets, and if the market dictates that that's what people want, that's what people want. I just think it goes to show you that the majority of Bitcoin is held by people in very privileged situations. That's something that I take away from the ordinal situation.
Yeah,
And I'm
I would
not trying
agree
to be
with that.
preachy.
No, I would agree with that. I think that's one of my primary distillations of it too, is that Bitcoin is still very much like a rich guy's thing. I mean, we're seeing freaking ordinal sell for like several Bitcoin each. So yeah,
Dude,
I think,
freaking fart. And someone sold a fart. I was trying to pull it
ordinal
up
fart.
for like 12.3 Bitcoin. Like,
It's a
oh my
privileged
God.
dude who buys the fart for 12.3 Bitcoin. I'll tell you that.
Dude, it makes me want to like burp and try to sell that as an ordinal. Like, I think I could just like retire off of that.
Yeah, if you had done it on sub 1K, you might have been able to.
Whatever. This feels like a
Yeah.
good time as any to remind everyone in the audience for the last time of the show to please make sure you like and subscribe down below on YouTube. If you are listening on a podcast platform, please leave us a review. Please make sure you subscribe to this channel to keep up to date. And of course, if you have not yet bought your tickets to Bitcoin 2023 in Miami, do so using the promo code QQQ. Get 10% off. If you do, I will know. So like you can't lie about it. I will know who uses my promo code, but I will smoke you the fuck out in Miami. So use the promo code Casey. I will give it to you for the final word. Thank you for staying a little later as well.
Oh, of course. Not much later at all. So follow me on Twitter, guys, at BTCCasey. I hardly ever post on there, but every once in a while you'll get some alpha from me. And mostly just keep up with my articles on Bitcoin Magazine. And I hope to see as many of you as possible in Miami. I'm really looking forward to that. We can all smoke marijuana together. It'll be a great time. And thanks for having me on, Q. It's always fantastic to talk Bitcoin with you.
This was an absolute treat. Just know I will be bothering you to come back very soon, my friend. I'm gonna go smoke this bad boy. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen,